The moment my wife Sophia locked eyes with me across Victor Blackwell's glass and chrome executive boardroom, I knew what was coming. I had been sensing it for months, the late nights at the office, the sudden weekend conferences, the way she'd silence her phone when I entered the room. My instincts had screamed at me to prepare for the inevitable betrayal, and I had. Yet watching it unfold before me, seeing the cold detachment in her eyes as she stood beside her billionaire boss, I still felt the knife twist of betrayal deep in my gut. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The decision is unanimous, David, Victor announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man used to ruining lives before lunch. Your services as Chief Innovation Officer are no longer required at Blackwell Industries. My soon-to-be ex-wife didn't even have the decency to look uncomfortable. Instead, she stood slightly behind her boss, her lover, with that small, triumphant smile playing at the corners of her lips. The same smile I'd seen the day we closed on our first house, the same smile from our wedding day, now weaponized against me. I glanced around the boardroom. The executive team avoided my gaze, suddenly fascinated by the quarterly reports in front of them or the panoramic view of the city skyline. All except for Jennifer Chen, our chief legal officer, whose subtle head tilt told me everything I needed to know. She was the only one who'd warned me in her cautious, professional way. David, keep your eyes open. Things are shifting. Victor Blackwell himself was the picture of calculated confidence in his tailored Italian suit. At 57, he was 20 years my senior, with silver hair that spoke of distinguished experience rather than age. His empire, Blackwell Industries, had swallowed my startup 3 years ago with promises of resources, growth, and autonomy, promises that apparently had an expiration date. If there's nothing else, Victor continued, checking his Patek Philippe watch as if my career assassination was running long. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. I remained seated, adjusting my cufflinks, the ones Sophia had given me on our last anniversary. Actually, I said, my voice measured and calm despite the hurricane raging inside me, there is one small matter. The slight furrow in Victor's brow was the first crack in his composure. He hadn't expected anything but shocked capitulation. What matter? He asked, impatience barely concealed. I reached into my leather messenger bag, the same one I'd carried since founding my company 7 years ago, and withdrew a sealed envelope. I slid it across the polished table toward Jennifer, not toward Victor. Never show your cards to the opponent directly. Would you mind refreshing everyone's memory about Section 17.3 of the acquisition agreement? I asked, keeping my eyes on Jennifer. The room went silent. Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their ergonomic chairs. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sophia's smile faltered for the first time. Jennifer opened the envelope with practiced precision, though I knew she already understood what it contained. After all, she had helped draft the very clause I was invoking. Section 17.3, she began, her voice carrying the neutral tone of someone reading legal language while understanding the bomb contained within, states that in the event of termination of any founding member of Nexus Technologies, my former company, within 5 years of acquisition, all proprietary intellectual property developed by said founding member reverts to their personal ownership unless terminated for documented performance failures over a minimum 6-month period. The blood drained from Victor's face as the implications sank in. 3 years into the 5-year period, no performance improvement plan, no documentation of failures. Furthermore, Jennifer continued, a hint of satisfaction now detectable in her voice, any products substantially derived from said intellectual property must either be discontinued or licensed directly from the original creator at market rates. My calmness wasn't an act anymore. It was the tranquility that comes with absolute certainty. As you all know, Project Nexus forms the backbone of Blackwell's entire AI security division now. Quite the oversight to fire its creator without proper documentation, wouldn't you say? Victor's composure shattered. This is absurd. The company owns all intellectual property developed during employment, yes, I interrupted smoothly, but Section 17.3 was my one non-negotiable condition during the acquisition. Your lawyers approved it, Victor. Perhaps you should have read the fine print before sleeping with my wife and firing me without cause. I allowed myself a glance at Sophia. Her triumphant smile had vanished completely, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Good. She should be afraid. She knew better than anyone what I was capable of when betrayed. This is a simple misunderstanding, Victor attempted, switching tactics. We can discuss your continued role. My continued role? I repeated, allowing a small, cold laugh to escape. I think that opportunity expired about 10 minutes ago, around the time you unanimously voted me out. I stood up, buttoning my jacket with deliberate slowness. You have two options, Victor. Either buy a license for my intellectual property at market value, which, given that it generates approximately 40% of Blackwell's current revenue, would cost you roughly $350 million annually, or cease using it immediately. The room erupted into chaos. Board members turned to Victor, demanding explanations. His CFO was already frantically typing on his tablet, presumably calculating the financial impact. Through it all, Jennifer sat calmly, almost imperceptibly nodding at me. Victor slammed his hand on the table. Enough! This meeting is adjourned. David, my office. Now. I shook my head. I don't think so. Any further discussions will happen with my legal team present. You'll be hearing from them tomorrow. I gathered my messenger bag and headed for the door, pausing only briefly beside Sophia. Interesting choice you made, I said quietly, so only she could hear. Hope it was worth it. As I walked out of the boardroom, I felt dozens of eyes on my back. Not a single person moved to stop me, not even security. They already knew which way the wind was blowing. My phone buzzed as I waited for the elevator. A text from Jennifer. Well played, but this is just the opening move. Be careful. I stepped into the elevator alone, watching the doors close on the empire that had just made its first critical mistake. As the elevator descended, I allowed myself a moment of genuine emotion. The betrayal stung, both professional and deeply personal. For 2 years, I had poured my innovation, my creativity, my very soul into Blackwell Industries. And for 5 years, I had loved Sophia completely, and they had both discarded me as if I were nothing. But I wasn't nothing. I was the man who had created the technology that transformed Blackwell Industries from a middling tech company into a cybersecurity powerhouse. I was the mind behind the innovation that had tripled their stock price, and now I was their biggest threat. As I walked through the gleaming lobby, past the massive B logo I had helped redesign, I didn't look back. The security guards nodded, respectfully. They hadn't received orders to treat me as hostile. Not yet. Outside, the spring air hit my face. I loosened my tie and took a deep breath. This wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. I had anticipated this betrayal for months. I had prepared, documented, secured my position. What Victor and Sophia didn't know, couldn't know, was that I had been 10 steps ahead of them from the moment I noticed the first lingering glance between them at last year's holiday party. They thought they were ending my story today. In reality, they had just become characters in mine. I didn't go home that night, not to the sprawling downtown penthouse Sophia and I had purchased after the acquisition of my company. That space, with its carefully curated furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, no longer felt like mine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Instead, I drove to the small apartment I had quietly leased 3 months ago when the first signs of betrayal became impossible to ignore. The apartment was Spartan. A mattress on the floor, a desk with 3 monitors, and a small kitchen table. Covered in legal documents and schematics, the refrigerator contained nothing but energy drinks and takeout containers. This wasn't a home, it was a war room. I loosened my tie and poured myself 2 fingers of whiskey, watching the amber liquid catch the light as I contemplated my next move. My phone had been buzzing incessantly since I left the Blackwell building, calls from board members, frantic texts from middle management who'd heard rumors, and finally a message from Sophia. "We need to talk. What you're doing isn't fair to anyone." I laughed bitterly. Fair, as if anything about her sleeping with my boss while plotting my professional execution had been fair. I ignored her message and instead called the one person I knew I could trust. Jennifer Chen answered on the first ring. "You're the talk of the building," she said without preamble. "Security was told to revoke your access, but IT is in panic mode trying to figure out how dependent our systems are on your architecture." "And Victor?" I asked, taking a sip of whiskey. "Closeted with the executive team and legal counsel. Not me, of course. I've apparently been sidelined due to potential conflicts of interest." I smiled at that. Smart of him. "Not smart enough," Jennifer replied. "He should have done it months ago. I've documented everything, by the way, every meeting, every email thread. The board was misled about your performance reviews." "I assumed as much," I said. "What about the rest of the plan?" Jennifer's voice lowered. "Everything's in place, but David, are you sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back." I walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there was the Blackwell Tower, where Victor was undoubtedly scrambling to contain the situation. Somewhere out there was Sophia, perhaps already regretting her choices. "They didn't give me a choice," I said finally. "They made their move. Now I make mine." After hanging up, I opened my laptop and typed a series of commands, accessing a secure server. 3 years at Blackwell Industries had given me intimate knowledge of their systems, knowledge I had leveraged while building in back doors that only I could access. Not for corporate espionage or sabotage, but for protection, insurance policies coded into the very architecture of the systems I'd built. My phone rang again. This time, it was Victor Blackwell himself. I let it ring 4 times before answering, making him wait just long enough to demonstrate that I was in control now. "David," he said, his voice artificially calm, "I think we got off on the wrong foot today." "Is that what you call firing someone without cause while sleeping with his wife?" I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "An unfortunate misstep." Victor cleared his throat. "Business and personal matters should remain separate. I'm calling to discuss a reasonable solution to our contractual situation." "I'm listening. The clause you mentioned is problematic but not insurmountable. I'm prepared to offer you a generous consulting arrangement, $5 million annually for 5 years. You retain an advisory position, we retain usage rights to the technology. $5 million, a tenth of what I deserved, 100th of what it was worth to Blackwell Industries." "That's an interesting starting position, Victor," I said carefully. "Unfortunately, it's not even close to market value. Be reasonable, David. Your contribution was significant, but Blackwell has developed the technology considerably since acquisition." "With my guidance," I reminded him. "Under my direction, using my frameworks and my innovation. Our legal team believes we have strong grounds to challenge your interpretation of Section 17(3), Victor continued, ignoring my point. His voice hardened. "This could drag through courts for years. Neither of us wants that." "Actually," I replied, "I'm perfectly comfortable with that timeline. Are your shareholders What happens to Blackwell's stock price when the market learns that 40% of your revenue stream is under legal dispute? What happens to your AI security contracts when clients realize there might be continuity issues? Silence on the line. I had hit a nerve. 20 million annually, he finally said. My final offer. Not even close, Victor, but I appreciate the call. Have your legal team contact mine. I'm sure we can work something out. I hung up before he could respond. Less than 30 seconds later, my phone buzzed with a text from Sophia. You're making a terrible mistake. Victor isn't someone you want as an enemy. I didn't respond. Instead, I opened my email and sent a pre-drafted message to 27 key engineers and developers at Blackwell, all people who had come from my original company, Nexus Technologies. The message was simple. Coffee tomorrow at 7 a.m. The situation has changed. Your future options have expanded. Then I sent a second email to Martin Reynolds, a technology reporter at the Wall Street Journal who had covered my career since before the Blackwell acquisition. I have a story you might find interesting, off the record for now. Just as I was about to close my laptop, an email notification appeared from Jennifer Chen, subject line, "Found something you need to see." The attached documents made my breath catch. Internal financial records showing irregular payments from Blackwell Industries to offshore accounts. Project budgets with inflated costs and missing funds. And most damning of all, evidence that Victor had been systematically stealing my innovations and patenting them under his own name through shell companies. This wasn't just business anymore. This was fraud. I poured another whiskey and began to read through the documents carefully, making notes as I went. By the time the sun rose, I had constructed a complete picture of Victor's scheme, not just to push me out, but to steal everything I had built. At 6:30 a.m., I showered and dressed, in a fresh suit, not my usual corporate attire, but something sharper, more aggressive, battle armor. At 6:45 a.m., I received a text from Jennifer. Emergency board meeting called for 9 a.m. They're panicking. At 7 a.m., I walked into a coffee shop 3 blocks from Blackwell Tower. 22 of my former team members were waiting. Their expressions ranged from curious to concerned to downright furious on my behalf. "Thank you for coming," I said, standing before them. "What I'm about to share will require absolute discretion." For the next 45 minutes, I outlined what had happened and what I planned to do next. By the time I finished, the mood in the room had shifted from uncertainty to determination. "Are you with me?" I asked finally. One by one, they nodded. My team. My people. The true asset that Victor had undervalued. As we left the coffee shop, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. I answered to hear the voice of Margaret Blackwell, Victor's ex-wife, and still a major shareholder in Blackwell Industries. "Mr. Carson," she said, her voice elegant and measured, "I understand you're having some difficulties with my former husband. I believe we might have some common interests to discuss." I smiled as I stepped into the morning sunlight. "I'm listening." "Mrs. Blackwell, I'm absolutely listening." The pieces were moving into position. Victor had made his play, removing me from the board entirely. He thought the game was over. He didn't realize we were playing different games entirely, and in mine, he had just lost his queen while exposing his king. Margaret Blackwell chose the meeting location, a private dining room at the Meridian Club, an old money establishment that had been refusing membership to tech entrepreneurs like me for decades. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was entering as her guest while her ex-husband, despite his wealth and position, had reportedly been denied membership 3 times. I arrived 15 minutes early, a habit from my startup days. The maître d' led me through the main dining room, where silver-haired men in bespoke suits looked up briefly from their conversations about hedge funds and hunting lodges. I felt their dismissive glances like a physical force. I didn't belong. Here, not yet. The private room was impeccably furnished, with dark wood paneling, oil paintings of stern-looking founders, and a table that could have seated 12, but was set for just 2. "Mr. Carson," Margaret said as she entered precisely on time, "thank you for meeting me." In person, Margaret Blackwell was more imposing than her photograph suggested. At 62, she carried herself with the poise of someone who had navigated treacherous waters and emerged stronger. Her silver-streaked black hair was pulled back in an elegant chignon, and she wore a simple but undoubtedly expensive charcoal suit. "Mrs. Blackwell," I acknowledged, standing as she approached. "I appreciate the invitation." "Margaret, please," she said, taking her seat and gesturing for me to do the same. "And let's dispense with pleasantries. We both know why we're here." A server appeared silently, pouring water and wine before disappearing again. Margaret took a small sip of the Bordeaux. "Victor has always had 2 significant flaws," she said, setting down her glass. "Arrogance and short-sightedness. It appears he's indulged in both at your expense." I studied her carefully. "You're still a major shareholder in Blackwell Industries." 32%, she confirmed. "The divorce settlement was comprehensive. Victor fought to reduce my stake, but my family's initial investment built the foundation of what Blackwell is today. Something the board remembered during our negotiations." I nodded slowly. "And now you're concerned about your investment." A small smile crossed her lips. "Let's just say I'm concerned about Victor's stewardship. The company has flourished in recent years, largely due to your innovations, I understand, but Victor has become increasingly reckless." "You mean personally or professionally?" I asked, thinking about Sophia. "Both," Margaret replied flatly. "His pattern with younger women in the workplace isn't new, just particularly unwise in your case, given your value to the company." She reached into a sleek leather portfolio and withdrew a folder, sliding it across the table to me. "What's this?" I asked, though I already had a suspicion. "Financial records, board minutes, evidence of systematic fraud spanning the last 2 years. Not dissimilar to what your colleague Ms. Chen discovered, but more extensive." I opened the folder, scanning the contents. The depth of information was staggering, far beyond what Jennifer had uncovered. This wasn't just opportunistic fraud. This was a pattern of deliberate financial manipulation and intellectual property theft. "You've been gathering this for some time," I observed, looking up to meet her gaze. "Since approximately 3 months after our divorce was finalized." She acknowledged. "Call it intuition or experience." "Why show me this now?" Margaret took another sip of wine, considering her words carefully. "Because Victor has finally made a mistake that can't be concealed or explained away. Firing you triggers. Section 17(3), a clause you brilliantly inserted, by the way. I admire foresight. I still don't understand what you want from me." "An alliance, Mr. Carson, one that benefits us both." She leaned forward slightly. "I want Victor removed as CEO. You want your intellectual property protected, and, I suspect, a measure of justice. Together, we control or influence enough to make that happen." I closed the folder. "You have 32%. Even with my allies on the board, that's not a majority." Her smile widened fractionally. "That's where the strategic revelation comes. And I have something else that changes everything." From her portfolio, she withdrew a second, thinner folder. Inside was a single document, a trust agreement. I skimmed it quickly, then looked up in genuine surprise. "Victor transferred an additional 15% of company shares to a trust," I said, processing the implications. "With you as trustee." "For our children," Margaret clarified. "A tax strategy his advisors recommended. Victor maintains voting rights while he serves as CEO, but should he be removed from that position, the voting rights revert to you as trustee," I finished, unable to hide my admiration. "He created a mechanism for his own removal." "Precisely. In his arrogance, he never imagined a scenario where the board would consider removing him. But with These fraud allegations, your intellectual property claim, and his personal indiscretions. The board would have no choice, I said slowly, seeing the complete picture forming. They'd have a fiduciary duty to remove him. Margaret nodded, and sharply. Now you understand. Why not do this yourself, I asked. Why involve me at all? Because your claim gives the board a legitimate documented reason to act that doesn't appear to be a vindictive ex-wife's machination, she replied pragmatically, and because your technology is genuinely valuable to the company's future. For the first time since entering the room, I allowed myself a real smile. What exactly are you proposing? A coordinated approach. I call for a special shareholders meeting. You present your intellectual property claim and the evidence of fraud. The board removes Victor as CEO to protect shareholder value. With my shares and the trust shares, I control the appointment of his replacement. She paused. You. The offer hung in the air between us. CEO of Blackwell Industries. It was more than revenge. It was vindication. Victory. The complete reversal. A fortune Victor had never seen coming. And what do you get out of this arrangement? I asked, knowing there had to be more. Protection of my investment. A capable CEO who understands the technology that drives the company's value. And, she added with the faintest gleam in her eye, the satisfaction of teaching Victor a lesson about underestimating the people around him, particularly the women. Including my wife, I couldn't help asking. Margaret's expression softened, almost imperceptibly. Sophia is young and ambitious. Victor used that as he has with others. I don't excuse her choices, but I recognize the pattern. She straightened the papers in front of her with manicured fingers. We all make decisions, Mr. Carson. The question is whether we're prepared for their consequences. Victor never is. I suspect you always are. I considered her words, weighing options and outcomes as I had learned to do throughout my career. This alliance wasn't just advantageous, it was transformative. With Margaret's backing and my technological leverage, we wouldn't just wound Victor Blackwell. We would replace him entirely. We'll need more than just the fraud evidence and my IP claim, I said finally. We need to show the board a future for Blackwell Industries that's more compelling than its present. Margaret's expression shifted, subtly. Approval, perhaps even respect. I was hoping you'd say that. I've taken the liberty of arranging a meeting tomorrow with 3 key board members who are receptive to change. People who remember when Blackwell stood for innovation, not manipulation. She extended her hand across the table. Do we have an agreement, Mr. Carson? I took her hand, sealing the alliance that would change everything. We do, Margaret, and please call me David. As we shook hands, I felt something I hadn't experienced since walking out of Blackwell Tower, absolute certainty. Victor had betrayed me professionally. Sophia had betrayed me personally. They thought they had taken everything from me. Instead, they had given me the opening I needed to take everything from them. Victor's response came swiftly, as I knew it would. By 7 a.m. the following morning, every major tech publication had received the same press release. Blackwell Industries files. Lawsuit against former employee for breach of contract and corporate espionage. The allegations were as false as they were predictable. Claims that I had stolen proprietary information, violated confidentiality agreements, and attempted to poach employees after my justified termination due to performance issues. I read the press release on my tablet while sipping coffee in the war room apartment, not surprised, but still taking note of every accusation. Each lie would become another nail in Victor's professional coffin. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. Emergency all-hands meeting called for 9 a.m. Victor's on the warpath. I smiled slightly. Perfect. Proceed as planned. At precisely 8:55 a.m., while Victor was undoubtedly preparing to address his nervous employees about the David Carson situation, my counterattack began. First, my legal team filed our own motion. In court. Not just a defense against Victor's baseless lawsuit, but an aggressive countersuit outlining the intellectual property violations under Section 17.3 and demanding immediate injunctive relief. The filing included comprehensive documentation of my contributions, the acquisition agreement with the critical clause highlighted, and affidavits from key engineers confirming my role in developing the technology that now powered Blackwell's most profitable division. Second, Martin Reynolds at the Wall Street Journal published his exclusive story. Tech innovator claims Blackwell Industries built empire on stolen IP. The article was carefully worded to avoid defamation while raising serious questions about Blackwell's business practices. It mentioned the specific value of my technology to the company, backed by analyst estimates, and noted that sources close to the board were concerned about the potential impact on shareholder value. Third, and perhaps most devastating, 22. Resignation letters landed simultaneously on the desks of Blackwell's HR department. My former team members, the architects and engineers who actually understood how the Nexus technology worked, all walking out in coordinated solidarity. Their departure wasn't just symbolic, it was functional. No one remaining at Blackwell had the complete knowledge to maintain or develop the systems I had designed. I imagined the scene at Blackwell Tower, Victor standing before his employees, attempting to project confidence while his phone exploded. With crisis alerts, the lawsuit, the article, the mass resignations, all hitting at once, precisely when he was most visible and vulnerable. My phone rang. "Margaret Blackwell." "Your timing is exquisite," she said, a note of genuine admiration in her voice. "The board chairman just contacted me. They're calling an emergency session for this afternoon." "Sooner than we expected," I observed. "Crisis has a way of accelerating decision-making. Have you seen the stock price?" I switched to my trading app. Blackwell Industries had opened down 7% and was continuing to slide as the market digested the implications of the lawsuit and countersuit. "The institutional investors are getting nervous," Margaret continued. "Two major funds have requested private calls with board members. They're asking about continuity plans and risk mitigation." "Perfect," I replied. "What about our meeting with the 3 board members?" "Still on for noon. They're even more receptive now, given the circumstances." I ended the call and checked my other messages. 17 interview requests from tech journalists, an email from a competing firm offering me a strategic advisory position with a 7-figure salary, and finally, a text from Sophia. "What have you done?" "Victor is furious. This isn't what I wanted." I stared at her message for a long moment. This isn't what I wanted. As if she had played no active role in the betrayal. As if she had been a passive observer, rather than a willing participant in both my personal and professional destruction. I typed a response. "Actions have consequences, Sophia. You're just beginning to experience yours." The noon meeting with the board members took place in Margaret's penthouse, neutral territory, away from Blackwell Tower and its potential corporate espionage. The 3 directors arrived separately to avoid drawing attention. James Harrington, the longest-serving board member who had known Margaret's family for decades, Diane Zhang, who headed the Technology Oversight Committee, and Michael Okafor, who represented the company's largest institutional investor. "Gentlemen, Dr. Zhang," Margaret greeted them with practiced hospitality, "thank you for coming on such short notice." I observed their body language as they entered. Harrington was tense but composed, old-school corporate, accustomed to weathering crises. Zhang appeared openly concerned, her quick eyes assessing me with professional curiosity. Okafor was the most guarded, his expression revealing nothing as he took his seat at Margaret's dining table. "Let's be direct," Harrington began once pleasantries were exchanged. "The company is facing a serious threat. The market is responding accordingly." "Not a threat," I corrected calmly. A correction. Blackwell has been operating under false pretenses regarding ownership of its core technology. That's a serious allegation, Mr. Carson, Okafor noted, his voice deep and measured. One backed by extensive documentation, Margaret interjected, sliding folders toward each board member, including the original acquisition agreement with Section 17.3 highlighted. Zhang opened her folder first, scanning the contents with practiced efficiency. Her eyebrows rose slightly as she reached the relevant clause. This appears legitimate, she admitted, but Victor claims you violated other terms of your employment. A convenient assertion, I replied, made after I revealed the IP ownership issue. If there were genuine performance concerns, where is the documentation, the improvement plans, the warnings? Harrington frowned. There are none in your personnel file. I checked personally this morning. Because they don't exist, I said firmly. My termination was personal, not professional, and it triggered a clause that now puts billions in company value at risk. Okafor leaned forward. Even if everything you claim is true, what's your end game here, Mr. Carson? A larger settlement? Reinstatement? I met his gaze directly. Neither. I want to protect the technology I created and ensure it continues to develop properly. That can't happen under current leadership. You're proposing a change in management, Zhang stated rather than asked. I'm proposing a solution to a crisis. That's only beginning, I corrected. The technology that powers Blackwell's AI security division is complex and evolving. The team that understood it has resigned en masse. The market is reacting to uncertainty, and your CEO is focused on personal vendettas rather than shareholder value. Margaret opened her own folder, revealing the second bombshell. There's also the matter of the financial irregularities. She outlined the evidence of fraud with clinical precision, the offshore accounts, the misappropriated research funds, the patents filed through shell companies. The board members' expressions shifted from concern to alarm as the full picture emerged. How long have you known about this? Harrington asked Margaret directly. Long enough to verify everything independently, she replied. The documentation is extensive and conclusive. Okafor closed his folder deliberately. If this information becomes public, the SEC will open an investigation. The stock will plummet further. The company could face existential risk. Unless, I said quietly, decisive action is taken immediately. The implication hung in the air. There was only one form of decisive action that could possibly contain this crisis. The emergency board meeting is scheduled for 4 p.m., Zhang noted. Victor expects it to focus on litigation strategy against Mr. Carson. Instead, Margaret suggested smoothly, it should focus on leadership transition for the protection of shareholder value. Harrington looked between Margaret and me, understanding dawning in his eyes. You've orchestrated this quite thoroughly. I didn't deny it. I prepared for contingencies. Victor made his choice. Now the board must make theirs. The three board members exchanged glances, decades of corporate experience, allowing them to communicate volumes without words. Finally, Harrington nodded almost imperceptibly. We'll need a formal succession plan, he said. A name to put forward. Margaret smiled. I believe Mr. Carson has demonstrated exactly the kind of strategic thinking and technological expertise Blackwell Industries requires in its leadership. Zhang studied me with renewed interest. You plan to take his company all along? No. I corrected her. I plan to protect my technology and my reputation. Victor's decisions have created this opportunity for transition. Okafor stood, straightening his jacket. The board meeting will be illuminating. I suggest you both be available afterward. As they departed, Margaret poured 2 glasses of champagne, offering one to me. We don't celebrate yet, I cautioned. This isn't celebration, she replied. This is acknowledgement. The first counteraction has succeeded. Victor is now fighting for his professional life, and he doesn't even realize it's already over. I took the glass, clinking it against hers. To strategic thinking. And to consequences, she added with a satisfied smile. While the board met to decide Victor's fate, though they didn't yet fully realize that's what they were doing, I returned to my war room apartment. The space had transformed in the past 48 hours, evolving from a Spartan bachelor pad into a fully operational command center. 3 additional monitors had been set up, a secure server hummed quietly in the corner, and documents covered every available surface. Jennifer had arrived with 2 trusted colleagues from Blackwell's legal department who had chosen to resign alongside her rather than continue under Victor's leadership. They were now carefully organizing evidence into categories: intellectual, property violations, financial fraud, corporate governance failures, and personal misconduct. The board meeting started 10 minutes ago, Jennifer announced, checking her watch. I still have access to the calendar system. Victor scheduled 2 hours. He'll need more than that, I replied, reviewing a particularly damning email thread that showed Victor explicitly instructing his CFO to misrepresent R&D expenditures to inflate quarterly earnings. This is extraordinary, said Elena Vasquez, one of the former Blackwell lawyers now working with us. In 20 years of corporate law, I've never seen such blatant fraud documented in writing. Victor's arrogance has always been his weakness, Jennifer commented. He doesn't believe rules apply to him, so he doesn't bother covering his tracks properly. My phone buzzed. A text from Margaret. The trap is set. Evidence presented. Victor denying everything. I smiled slightly. Phase 2 is underway, while Victor desperately tried to maintain control of the board meeting. We continued our methodical evidence gathering. Each document, each email, each financial record was another strand in the web that would eventually ensnare him completely. The most damaging evidence had come from an unexpected source. 3 hours earlier, I had received an encrypted email from Thomas Winters, Blackwell's chief financial officer. The subject line was simple: insurance policy. Winters had been with Victor for 15 years, managing the company's finances through its expansion and the acquisition of my company, Nexus Technologies. He had always struck me as competent but complicit, a loyal lieutenant who followed orders without question. I had underestimated him. The attached files revealed that Winters had been documenting Victor's financial misconduct for years, creating a personal insurance policy against the day when Victor might turn on him, as he had turned on so many others. Bank transfers to offshore accounts, falsified board reports, tax evasion schemes. Most significantly, Winters had documented Victor's systematic theft of my innovations. Emails showed Victor explicitly ordering teams to extract my technologies, core elements, and repackage them under different names for patent applications filed through shell companies. In one particularly damning exchange, Victor had written, "Carson thinks too small. His technology has applications beyond what he imagines. Once we secure independent patents, we can phase him out entirely." That email was dated just 3 months after the acquisition, proving that Victor had planned to betray me from the very beginning. "Why would Winters send this to you now?" Jennifer asked, reviewing the CFO's evidence. "Self-preservation," I replied. "He sees which way the wind is blowing. Better to switch sides early than go down with Victor." Elena nodded. "Smart move. This documentation would be enough for criminal charges, not just civil penalties." My phone buzzed again. Another update from Margaret. Victor losing control, becoming hostile. Zhang asked direct questions about financial reporting. Good. Zhang, with her technological background, would understand exactly how serious the intellectual property theft was. Her questions would force Victor into a corner, either admit to misleading the board or double down on his denials despite mounting evidence. "What about Sophia?" Jennifer asked quietly. voicing the question I had been deliberately avoiding. I kept my expression neutral, though the mention of my wife's name still triggered a complex mixture of anger and grief. What about her? Is she implicated in any of this? Did she know about the fraud? I turned to the window, considering the question. Had Sophia been an active participant in Victor's schemes, or merely a pawn, a trophy he had seduced away from? Me as part of his power play? I don't know, I admitted finally, but I intend to find out. As if summoned by the conversation, my phone rang. Sophia's name flashed on the screen. I hesitated, then answered, putting it on speaker so Jennifer and the legal team could hear. David. Her voice was tight, controlled. This has gone far enough. You need to stop this vendetta before people get hurt. People have already been hurt, Sophia, I replied evenly. I was fired from my position. My reputation was attacked. My technology was stolen. That's business, she said dismissively. I'm talking about real damage. Do you have any idea what you're doing to the company, to people's jobs, to our future? Our future. The audacity of the phrase made something cold settle in my chest. Our future ended the moment you chose Victor over me, both personally and professionally. A slight pause. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You're lashing out because I left you. No, Sophia. I'm protecting what's mine, my innovations, my reputation, my legacy. The fact that you betrayed me personally just made it easier to see clearly. Victor wants to meet, she said, changing tactics. Just the three of us, tonight. We can resolve this like adults. I laughed softly, like the adults who conspired behind my back, who planned my professional execution, who thought I wouldn't notice or wouldn't fight back. David, please. Tell Victor if he wants to communicate with me, he can do it through my lawyers or at the shareholder meeting Margaret is calling. Those are his only options now. I ended the call before she could respond, turning back to the room. Jennifer's expression was a mixture of concern and approval. She's recording conversations, Eleanor said immediately. That call was too convenient, too structured. She's gathering ammunition, I nodded. Undoubtedly, which is why I said nothing that couldn't be repeated in court or to the board. They're desperate, Jennifer observed. Victor must realize the board meeting isn't going his way. My phone buzzed with another update from Margaret. Meeting extended, SEC issues raised, Victor demanded private executive session, board refused. I smiled. He's trying to clear the room, to get potential allies away from the evidence. And they refused, Jennifer noted. That's significant. It means they've already decided, I agreed. They just haven't told him yet. Elena looked up from her laptop. We have another problem. Someone's trying to access the secure server where we stored the backup evidence. I moved to her side, examining the security logs. IP address, Blackwell Tower, executive floor. Victor's digital forensics team, I said, not surprised. They're looking for ways to discredit the evidence or claim it was fabricated. Can they get in? Jennifer asked, concerned. I shook my head. No, the security protocols I designed are impenetrable without physical access to the authentication keys. I held up a small encrypted drive hanging from my keychain. And I have the only copy. As evening approached, the apartment took on the atmosphere of a war room in the final hours before a decisive battle. Maps had been replaced by organizational charts, munitions by evidence folders, but the strategic intensity was the same. Every contingency had been planned for, every weakness identified, every strength leveraged. My phone rang again, a number I didn't recognize. Mr. Carson, said a voice I immediately identified as Michael Okafor, the board member representing institutional investors. The board meeting has concluded. And, I asked, though I already suspected the answer from his tone, the board has voted to place Victor Blackwell on administrative leave pending a full investigation of the allegations. Chief Operating Officer Patricia Winters will serve as interim CEO. Thomas Winters' wife. An interesting choice, and a clear signal that Winters' evidence had been decisive. I see, I replied neutrally. And the intellectual property claims? We've instructed outside counsel to review the acquisition agreement and prepare options. For resolution, the board acknowledges there are significant concerns about the current situation. Translation: they knew I had them cornered on the IP front. Thank you for the update, Mr. Okafor. I look forward to a productive resolution. After ending the call, I turned to Jennifer and the legal team. Victor's been suspended. Patricia Winters is interim CEO. Jennifer smiled slightly. Phase 2 complete. Not quite, I cautioned. This is just the first step. Victor will fight back hard. He still has allies, resources, and nothing to lose. As if confirming my prediction, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. You think you've won? This is just beginning. I built this company. I am this company. You have no idea what I'm capable of. V. I showed the message to Jennifer, who frowned. He's unraveling. Good, I replied. The more erratic his behavior, the easier our next steps will be. I walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Victor was plotting his counterattack. Somewhere out there, Sophia was realizing she had tied her fate to a falling star, but here, in this room, we had the evidence, the strategy, and most importantly, the truth. Victor had stolen my company, my innovations, and my wife. Now I was going to take everything from him, starting with the empire he thought was untouchable. Prepare the shareholder presentation, I instructed the team. Margaret's calling for a vote in 3 days. By the end of the week, Blackwell Industries will have new leadership. Jennifer nodded, determination in her eyes. And Victor Blackwell will have nothing. Nothing, I agreed, except the consequences of his own actions. Victor's suspension sent shockwaves through Blackwell Industries. By morning, the news had leaked to the press, and the company's stock had stabilized somewhat, the market preferring decisive board action to ongoing uncertainty. But within the company's sleek headquarters, alliances were shifting like tectonic plates before an earthquake. I watched it unfold from afar, receiving regular updates from my growing network of allies inside the company. Department heads who had once aligned themselves with Victor were now carefully distancing themselves, suddenly remembering instances when they had questioned his decisions or expressed concerns about his leadership style. Middle managers who had executed his dubious directives now claimed they had been just following orders, unaware of any impropriety. The corporate amnesia was as predictable as it was pathetic. Patricia Winters, the interim CEO, was proving to be neither Victor's puppet nor his replacement, but something more interesting. A pragmatist determined to stabilize the company while the board determined its future direction. Her first official act had been to form a special committee to review the intellectual property claims, my claims, and recommend a resolution. She's buying time, Jennifer observed when I shared this update at our morning strategy session. Smart move. For the company, yes, I agreed, but time works in our favor, not Victor's. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. Key investors, requesting private meeting with you. 2 p.m. at my penthouse. Crucial you attend. I showed the message to Jennifer, who raised an eyebrow. Institutional investors going around the board? That's significant. They're hedging their bets, I replied. They want to assess whether I'm a viable alternative to Victor. Are you? She asked, watching me carefully. I smiled slightly. What do you think? The investor meeting was smaller than I expected, just 2 people representing the largest institutional shareholders in Blackwell Industries. Elizabeth Monroe from Vanguard Capital, which held nearly 8% of Blackwell stock, and Wei Chen from Pacific Investment Group with another 6%. Together with Margaret's shares and the trust shares she controlled, they represented a decisive voting bloc. "Mr. Carson," Monroe began after brief introductions, "we appreciate your willingness to meet on such short notice. Circumstances require flexibility," I replied smoothly. "I understand you have concerns about Blackwell's future." Chen nodded. "Direct and to the point. Good. Yes, we have significant concerns. Our analysts estimate your intellectual property claims could impact up to 40% of Blackwell's current revenue stream." "That's a conservative estimate," I confirmed. Monroe leaned forward slightly. "The board's suspension of Victor Blackwell suggests the fraud allegations have merit. Our due diligence confirms the same. What remains unclear is the path forward." "What are your intentions, Mr. Carson?" Chen asked bluntly. "A lucrative settlement, a scorched earth campaign, or something else entirely?" I measured my response carefully, knowing this moment could determine whether these powerful investors became allies or obstacles. "My intention is to protect the technology I created while ensuring Blackwell Industries thrives in the long term. The company has extraordinary potential that Victor's leadership was squandering through short-term thinking and personal enrichment." "And you believe you could provide better leadership?" Monroe asked, her tone neutral, but her eyes sharp with assessment. "I built a company that Victor valued enough to acquire for $120 million. I created technology that now generates nearly $400 million in annual revenue. And most importantly, I understand that innovation requires integrity, something Blackwell has lost under Victor's leadership." Chen and Monroe exchanged glances, the subtle communication of experienced investors who had heard countless pitches and promises. "Margaret believes you're the right choice to lead Blackwell forward," Chen noted, turning to where Margaret sat quietly observing our exchange. "Her judgment carries significant weight. But we need more than judgment," Monroe added. "We need a concrete plan that addresses both the immediate crisis and the long-term vision." I reached into my briefcase and withdrew 3 bound presentations. "I anticipated your concerns." The document I had prepared outlined not just a resolution to the intellectual property dispute, but a comprehensive restructuring of Blackwell Industries, streamlining divisions, realigning research priorities, and implementing governance reforms to prevent future abuses. For the next 40 minutes, I walked them through my vision for the company's future, answering their increasingly detailed questions with the confidence of someone who had been preparing for this moment since the day. Victor had betrayed me. When I finished, Monroe closed the presentation and sat back. "Impressive, Mr. Carson. You've clearly given this considerable thought." "Not just thought," Margaret interjected. "David has assembled a transition team of top talent, including key engineers who left Blackwell this week. They're prepared to return under new leadership." Chen's expression remained carefully neutral, but I detected a slight shift in his posture, interest, perhaps even approval. "There's still the matter of the shareholder vote," he noted. "Victor may be suspended, but he still controls significant shares and has allies on the board." "Which is why this meeting is so important," Margaret replied smoothly. "With your support, we can ensure the company moves forward rather than remaining mired in Victor's misconduct." Monroe and Chen exchanged another look, this one longer and more significant. "We'll need to consult with our investment committees," Monroe said finally. "But speaking personally, I find Mr. Carson's plan compelling." After they departed, Margaret poured 2 glasses of her excellent scotch. "That went even better than I expected." I accepted the glass but didn't drink immediately. "They haven't committed yet." "They will," she said with quiet certainty. "Elizabeth was taking notes on potential board nominees for after the transition. She wouldn't do that if she weren't already decided." My phone buzzed with a message from Jennifer. Victor just left the tower with a security escort. Witnesses say he was shouting about betrayal. The alliance is crumbling faster than we anticipated. I showed the message to Margaret, who smiled slightly. Right on schedule. I should get back to the team, I said, rising. The shareholder meeting is in 2 days, and there's still much to prepare. Margaret walked me to the door of her penthouse. One more thing, David. Sophia called me this morning. I froze, my hand on the doorknob. What did she want? To negotiate. She claims to have information about Victor's plans. Information she's willing to share in exchange for certain considerations. The betrayal twisted inside me again, fresh and sharp. What did you tell her? Margaret's smile was cold and perfect. I told her that treachery has consequences, and that she would soon discover exactly what they are. The night before the shareholder meeting, after weeks of relentless strategic planning and evidence gathering, I found myself alone in my apartment for the first time in days. The legal team had departed to prepare final documents. Jennifer had gone to meet with Patricia Winters, the interim CEO, who had quietly indicated her willingness to support an orderly transition. Even the constant stream of messages and updates had temporarily subsided. The sudden silence was disorienting. I poured myself a glass of 18-year-old Macallan, a bottle I had been saving for a special occasion. Tomorrow would certainly qualify, but tonight I needed the clarity it might provide. I carried the glass to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city lights, so similar to the view from the penthouse I had once shared with Sophia. Sophia. Even thinking her name still produced a complex ache, not just of betrayal and anger, but of loss. The woman I had loved, had built a life with, had trusted completely, was gone. In her place was a stranger who had calculated that Victor Blackwell offered more advantages than remaining loyal to her husband. My phone buzzed on the counter. I ignored it, letting myself sink into the moment of quiet reflection that had been so rare these past weeks. The city sprawled before me, millions of lives intersecting in countless ways. Somewhere out there, Victor was undoubtedly plotting his final desperate moves. Somewhere out there, Sophia was realizing the full implications of her choices. And here I stood, on the verge of taking control of the very corporation that had been the instrument of my professional execution. The irony wasn't lost on me. The buzzing of my phone became more insistent, 3 messages in rapid succession. With a sigh, I crossed the room to check it. All from Jennifer. Emergency. Sophia at lobby. Insisting on seeing you. Security asking for instructions. She claims to have critical information. Appears distressed. David? Instructions? I stared at the messages, conflicting impulses battling within me. Part of me wanted to instruct security to turn her away. Another part, a part I wasn't proud of, wanted to see her face when she realized how completely her plans with Victor had backfired. And a third part, smaller but persistent, simply wanted to understand why. Why him? Why betray everything we had built together? What had Victor offered that was worth destroying a marriage? Typed my response. Send her up, but you stay with security, monitor lobby cameras. If Victor appears, lock down the building. Less than 5 minutes later, a knock at my door. I took a deliberate moment before answering, steadying myself against the emotional impact of seeing her again in this context. When I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize her. The Sophia I knew was always immaculately presented. Designer clothes, perfect makeup, not a hair out of place. The woman standing before me looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair hastily pulled back, her expression a mixture of desperation and fear. "David," she said, her voice hoarse, "thank you for seeing me." I stepped aside wordlessly, allowing her to enter. She paused at the threshold, taking in the transformed apartment. The multiple monitors, the documents covering every surface, the evidence of the war room it had become. "You've been busy," she observed quietly. "Did you expect anything else?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral as I closed the door. "After what you and Victor did?" She flinched slightly at the direct accusation. "That's why I'm here. You don't have the full picture. Then enlighten me." I didn't offer her a seat or a drink. This wasn't a social call, and I wasn't going to pretend otherwise. Sophia ran a hand through her hair, a nervous gesture I hadn't seen from her in years. "Victor is dangerous, David. More dangerous than you realize. I'm well aware of his capacity for fraud and betrayal," I replied coldly. "I've spent weeks documenting it. It's worse than that." She looked directly at me for the first time. "He's planning something for tomorrow, something desperate." I studied her, looking for signs of deception. "Why tell me this? Why not go to the board or the interim CEO? "Because they wouldn't believe me." She laughed bitterly. "Why would they? I'm just the disloyal wife who helped orchestrate your removal. My credibility is non-existent. And yet you expect me to believe you." Her expression hardened slightly. "I expect you to protect yourself. Whatever you think of me now, I don't want to see you hurt." "A bit late for that concern, isn't it?" She accepted the barb without flinching. "I deserved that. But this isn't about us, David. It's about Victor. He's cornered, and he's becoming erratic. He has a plan to disrupt the shareholder meeting, to release information that he claims will destroy your reputation completely." I raised an eyebrow. "What information?" "He wouldn't tell me specifics, just that he had leverage he'd been saving. Something from before the acquisition." She hesitated. He said it would make everyone question everything about you, your technology, your character, everything." I considered her words carefully. Victor was desperate enough to try anything, but I had been meticulous in both my professional and personal life. There were no skeletons in my closet for him to expose, unless a cold realization settled over me. There was one vulnerability, not in my past, but in the original code for the Nexus technology. An architectural decision I had made early on that could, if presented without context, appear questionable. "Why are you really here, Sophia?" I asked quietly. "The truth, this time." She looked away, staring out at the city lights. "I made a mistake, David. A terrible mistake." "Which one? Sleeping with my boss? Helping him fire me? Or just backing the wrong horse?" Her head snapped back, eyes flashing with genuine anger. "Is that what you think? That I'm here because I'm trying to switch sides again?" "The thought had occurred to me," I admitted. "Your timing is remarkably convenient." She took a step toward me, then seemed to think better of it. "I was unhappy, David. For a long time. You were so focused on the company, on your technology, I felt invisible. So you decided to become visible to Victor instead. He paid attention. He made me feel valued." Her voice dropped. "I didn't intend for it to become what it did. And I certainly never wanted you pushed out of the company. That was all, Victor." "Yet you stood beside him in that boardroom," I reminded her. "You watched it happen and said nothing." "I was a coward," she admitted softly. By then, I was in, too deep. Victor had made it clear what would happen if I didn't support him completely. I studied her, searching for truth in her words. Was it possible she had been manipulated by Victor as well? He certainly had a history of using people and discarding them when they were no longer useful. "What does Victor have on you?" I asked suddenly, the pieces clicking into place. Sophia's expression confirmed my suspicion before she spoke. "Financial improprieties. He had me sign documents, arrangements I didn't fully understand. I think he was setting me up from the beginning, creating a paper trail that implicated me in his schemes. Insurance," I murmured, "in case you ever turned against him." She nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I've made so many mistakes, David. I don't expect forgiveness. I needed to warn you and to give you this." From her purse, she withdrew a flash drive. "Evidence, things I've collected since realizing what Victor really is. It might help tomorrow." I took it without touching her fingers, maintaining the physical distance between us. "I'll have it analyzed." "You should," she agreed. "Don't trust me. Just use the information." She turned toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I am sorry, David. Not just because I ended up on the losing side, but because I hurt the one person who was always honest with me." As she reached for the door handle, I found myself asking the question that had haunted me for weeks. Was any of it real, Sophia? Us? She looked back, her expression stripped of the polished facade she typically presented to the world. All of it was real, until I convinced myself I needed more than what we had. A sad smile touched her lips, ironic that in reaching for more, I lost everything that mattered. And then she was gone, leaving me alone with a flash drive that might contain critical evidence or a final trap, and the unsettling realization that even after everything, a part of me still cared what happened to her. I stared at the flash drive, in my palm, weighing trust against caution, personal history against strategic necessity. Then I reached for my phone. "Jennifer, I need the technical team, now. We may have new information about tomorrow." The reflective moment had passed. The battle resumed. The morning of the shareholder meeting dawned with a sense of inevitability. After weeks of strategic moves and counter-moves, evidence gathering and alliance building, the endgame was finally at hand. I dressed with deliberate care, charcoal suit, crisp white shirt, the subtle power tie Sophia had given me for my last birthday. A reminder of what had been lost and what was about to be gained. Jennifer arrived at my apartment at 7 a.m. sharp, accompanied by 2 security specialists, former military contractors who now worked for a private firm specializing in corporate protection. After Sophia's warning the previous night, we weren't taking any chances. "The flash drive was legitimate," Jennifer reported, handing me a tablet with the summarized findings. "Technical team worked through the night, analyzing it. There's evidence we didn't have before, emails between Victor and 3 board members, discussing ways to undermine your position months before your termination." I skimmed through the summary, noting the dates and names. These are the same board members who initially sided with Victor but switched their support after we revealed the IP clause. Exactly. They were part of his inner circle before they conveniently developed amnesia about their involvement. Jennifer's smile was sharp with satisfaction. We now have proof they knew about the fraudulent activities. "Useful leverage," I acknowledged. "What about Sophia's warning? Any indication of what Victor might be planning?" One of the security specialists, a woman named Hayes, with the watchful eyes of someone who had seen combat, stepped forward. "We've implemented countermeasures for the most likely scenarios, additional screening at entry points, communication protocols if something happens, evacuation routes secured. And we have this," Jennifer added, producing a sealed legal envelope. "Emergency injunction prepared by Judge Watkins. If Victor attempts to introduce any allegedly damaging information about you or the technology, we can immediately block it pending legal review." I nodded, impressed as always by Jennifer's thoroughness. "Any word from our key shareholders?" Monroe and Chen have both confirmed their support. Combined with Margaret's shares, we have the votes we need, assuming nothing dramatic changes. The equation. My phone buzzed with a message from Margaret. "Victor's making moves. 3 unexpected visitors at my penthouse this morning. Offering compromises." I declined. "Be careful today." I showed the message to Jennifer, who frowned. "He's getting desperate." "Good," I replied. "Desperate people make mistakes." We arrived at Blackwell Tower via the private underground entrance, avoiding the small crowd of financial reporters gathered at the main doors. The shareholder meeting would be held in the company's largest conference center on the 50th floor, a space designed to impress with its panoramic views and state-of-the-art technology. Security was visibly enhanced, with additional personnel stationed throughout the building. Patricia Winters, the interim CEO, had clearly taken Sophia's warning seriously as well. As we rode the executive elevator to the 50th floor, Jennifer reviewed our final strategy. Margaret will open with the call for leadership change. Financial evidence first, then the IP violations. You don't speak until after the initial case has been presented, and if Victor tries to interrupt or introduce his supposed damaging information, injunction ready, security alerted, we shut him down immediately. The elevator doors opened onto a scene of controlled chaos. Board members and major shareholders clustered in small groups, their conversations hushed but intense. Corporate counsel huddled near the entrance to the conference room, reviewing documents with worried expressions, and standing alone near the floor-to-ceiling windows, Victor Blackwell himself, still projecting an air of authority despite his suspension. His eyes locked with mine across the space. No smile, no acknowledgement, just cold calculation and barely contained fury. I returned his gaze steadily, neither advancing nor retreating, a silent declaration that I was not intimidated. Margaret approached from a side corridor, elegant as, always in a tailored navy suit. "David, Jennifer, good morning." She kept her voice professional, nothing in her manner suggesting we were allies in the corporate coup about to unfold. "The meeting will begin in 20 minutes. Most major shareholders have already arrived." "And Victor?" I asked quietly. Margaret's expression remained neutral, but her eyes conveyed warning. "He came with legal representation. 2 attorneys I don't recognize, not from the corporate counsel team." "Outside specialists," Jennifer murmured. "Has he said anything?" "Not to me. He's been working the room, speaking with some of the institutional investors and smaller shareholders. Damage control, most likely." As we spoke, I noticed Victor breaking away from his position by the windows, moving deliberately toward us. Jennifer tensed slightly, but I placed a hand on her arm. "Let him come," I said softly. "Better to know what he's planning." Victor approached, with the smooth confidence of a predator, his smile not reaching his eyes. "David, Margaret, how good of you both to come." His voice dripped with sarcasm. "Though I'm surprised you're willing to show your face, David, considering what's about to happen." "And what exactly is that, Victor?" I asked calmly. His smile widened fractionally. "The exposure of your fraud, of course. Did you really think I wouldn't protect myself? That I wouldn't have insurance against someone like you?" "Someone like me," I repeated. "You mean someone who creates genuinely valuable technology instead of stealing it?" A flicker of rage crossed his features before he controlled it. "We'll see how valuable your creation seems when shareholders learn what's really behind it." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "By the way, how's Sophia? She seemed distressed when she left my house last night." The deliberate provocation, the implication that Sophia had been with him even after warning me, was calculated to throw me off balance. 5 weeks ago, it might have worked. Now, I simply regarded him with something approaching pity. "You're finished, Victor. The only question is whether you leave with some dignity intact or none at all." His expression hardened. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." "Actually, I do." I nodded toward the conference room where shareholders were beginning to take their seats. "And in about 15 minutes, so will everyone else." He stepped back, straightening his perfectly tailored jacket. "This isn't over, David." "No," I agreed, "but it will be soon." As Victor walked away, Jennifer exhaled slowly. "He's planning something specific. That wasn't just bluster." "No," Margaret concurred. "He's too confident." I watched Victor speak, briefly to his attorneys before they entered the conference room. Whatever it is, we're ready. The evidence is too comprehensive. The alliance is too secure. Margaret checked her watch. It's time. Remember, I begin the proceedings, then the evidence presentation. You only speak when called upon. I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over me. After weeks of preparation, months of betrayal, and years of building the technology that had become the center of this conflict, the moment of resolution was finally at hand. As we entered the conference room, I noticed Sophia sitting quietly in the back row. Our eyes met briefly, hers questioning, perhaps even hopeful. I gave her no response, turning instead to face the assembled power brokers who would decide the fate of Blackwell Industries. The board chairman called the meeting to order, his voice betraying nervousness as he announced the special agenda item: discussion and vote regarding leadership transition at Blackwell Industries. Margaret rose smoothly, projecting absolute authority as she moved to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, shareholders of Blackwell Industries, I've called for this vote because our company stands at a critical crossroads. And with those words, the final battle for control began. Victor's expression darkened as Margaret methodically outlined the case against him. The financial improprieties, the patent violations, the abuse of corporate resources. With each damning slide, his attorneys whispered urgently to each other, clearly unprepared for the depth and specificity of the evidence. When Margaret concluded, the room fell silent. The chairman, visibly shaken by what had been presented, cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwell, would you like to respond to these allegations? Victor stood, smoothing his tie. Certainly. But before I address these creative interpretations of company business, I believe shareholders should see what Mr. Carson has been hiding all along. He nodded to his attorneys, who distributed folders to key shareholders, the true nature of the Nexus technology and the man who claims to have created it. The escalation had begun. A tense silence fell over the conference room as shareholders opened the folders Victor's attorneys had distributed. I remained outwardly calm, though my mind raced through potential scenarios. What had Victor discovered? What vulnerability had he identified that he believed could save him at this final hour? Jennifer caught my eye from across the room, holding up the emergency injunction questioningly. I gave a subtle shake of my head, better to know what we were dealing with before shutting it down. The board chairman frowned as he reviewed the document in his folder. Mr. Blackwell, what exactly are you alleging here? Victor's smile was triumphant as he approached the podium. Not an allegation, a revelation. The Nexus technology that forms the backbone of our AI security division wasn't created by David Carson. It was based on stolen code from Meridian Systems, a direct competitor. Murmurs rippled through the room. Victor pressed his advantage. The documentation in front of you shows code comparisons between early Nexus prototypes and Meridian's proprietary systems. The similarities are unmistakable. He turned to face me directly. Mr. Carson didn't innovate. He appropriated. And, in doing so, he exposed Blackwell Industries to potentially catastrophic legal liability. All eyes turned to me. The moment of truth had arrived. I rose slowly, buttoning my jacket as I approached the podium. Victor stepped aside, his expression smug, certain he had delivered the killing blow. Mr. Blackwell's allegations are partially correct, I began, causing another wave of murmurs. There are indeed similarities between early Nexus code and Meridian systems. Victor's smirk widened. What Mr. Blackwell failed to mention, I continued, is why those similarities exist. Perhaps he should have researched more thoroughly before attempting this particular gambit. I nodded to Jennifer, who activated the main presentation screen. A document appeared, an employment contract dated 7 years earlier. Before founding Nexus Technologies, I was the lead architect at Meridian Systems. The code in question was written by me under my previous employment. I paused, letting the implications sink in. And as this document clearly shows, my separation agreement with Meridian explicitly permitted me to use the architectural frameworks I had developed in future endeavors, provided specific proprietary implementations were not duplicated. Victor's expression froze. Furthermore, I continued, tapping my tablet to bring up a second document, Meridian's CEO provided this written confirmation during Blackwell's due diligence process for the Nexus acquisition, certifying that my technology did not infringe on their intellectual property and that all necessary permissions had been secured. The room had gone completely silent. Victor's attorneys were frantically reviewing their materials, looking increasingly concerned. In fact, I said, allowing a note of irony to enter my voice, Blackwell's legal team, under Mr. Blackwell's direction, conducted extensive IP clearance before acquiring Nexus Technologies. They found no issues then. How curious that Mr. Blackwell discovers these problems only when his leadership is challenged. Margaret spoke up from her seat. Are you suggesting, Mr. Carson, that Victor was aware these allegations were baseless when he raised them today? I met Victor's gaze directly. I'm not suggesting it. I'm stating it unequivocally. And I can prove it. With another tap on my tablet, a new document appeared on screen. An email from Victor to his private legal counsel dated just 3 days earlier. Find anything on Carson's tech. Doesn't matter if it's legitimate, just needs to create. Doubt long enough to survive the shareholder meeting. Victor lunged toward the podium. That's fabricated. This is outrageous. Security personnel moved immediately, positioning themselves between Victor and me. The email came from your secure server, Victor, I said calmly. The same server where you stored documentation of your financial fraud. The same server Sophia had access to. At the mention of Sophia's name, Victor's head snapped toward the back of the room where she sat. The look he gave her contained such venom that several people nearby physically recoiled. You, he snarled, you did this. Sophia met his gaze steadily, offering no denial. The board chairman cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwell, these accusations against Mr. Carson appear to have been made in bad faith. Do you have any legitimate defense against the original allegations regarding financial misconduct and intellectual property violations? Victor turned back to the front, visibly struggling to regain composure. His calculated facade was crumbling by the second, revealing the desperation beneath. These are all misunderstandings, he attempted, his voice lacking its usual authority. Business decisions made in the best interest of the company that are being deliberately mischaracterized. Mischaracterized. Jennifer stepped forward, placing a thick binder on the conference table. These are bank records showing transfers to offshore accounts under your control. Hardly a mischaracterization. One of Victor's attorneys whispered urgently in his ear, but he shrugged the man off, his face flushing with anger. This is a coordinated attack, Victor insisted, pointing accusingly at Margaret. My ex-wife has orchestrated this entire charade. Out of vindictiveness, she's manipulated Carson, manipulated the board, all to satisfy her vendetta against me. Margaret's expression remained perfectly composed. The financial records speak for themselves, Victor, as do the patent applications filed through your shell companies, and the emails, I added quietly, and the witness statements from your own financial team. I turned to address the shareholders directly. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence before you isn't about personal grievances. It's about systematic fraud, intellectual property theft, and gross violations of fiduciary duty. Victor Blackwell hasn't just betrayed me, he's betrayed every person in this room who trusted him with your investments. Victor's control finally shattered completely. You think you're so clever, don't you, Carson? He spat, his voice rising. You with your precious technology and your self-righteous integrity. You're nothing. I built this company. I made it what It is. Without me, Blackwell Industries wouldn't exist. Without you, I corrected calmly, Blackwell Industries wouldn't be facing an existential crisis of leadership and ethics. Without you, the company's reputation wouldn't be at risk. Without you, shareholders wouldn't be questioning whether their investments are safe. I gestured toward the assembled investors. These people entrusted you with their capital, their faith, their futures, and you repaid that trust with deception and self-dealing. Victor's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies and finding none. Even his attorneys were beginning to distance themselves physically, their body language communicating that they knew the battle was lost. In a final, desperate move, Victor turned to Elizabeth Monroe, representing Vanguard Capital's significant shareholding. Elizabeth, we've known each other for 15 years. You know what I've built here. You can't possibly support this coup. Monroe regarded him coolly. I support the fiduciary interests of our investors, Victor. The evidence presented today suggests those interests are best served by new leadership. Victor's face contorted with rage. This isn't over. If I go down, I'll take this entire company with me. I'll burn it to the ground before I let him take what's mine. The naked threat hung in the air, confirming every concern the shareholders might have had about Victor's stability and judgment. The board chairman signaled to security, who moved closer to Victor. I believe we've heard enough, the chairman said firmly. We'll proceed to the vote regarding leadership transition. No! Victor lunged toward me, his control completely shattered. You think you've won? You and Sophia both betrayed me. I made you. I made both of you. Security personnel intervened immediately, restraining Victor as he continued to shout increasingly incoherent threats and accusations. The shareholders watched in stunned silence as the man who had once embodied corporate power and sophistication dissolved into uncontrolled fury. Remove Mr. Blackwell from the proceedings, the chairman instructed security. We'll continue without him. As Victor was escorted from the room, still shouting threats, I caught Sophia's eye across the space. Her expression was complex, relief mixed with sadness, perhaps even a touch of regret. I gave her a barely perceptible nod, acknowledging her role in bringing Victor down, before turning back to the chairman. I apologize for the disruption, I said calmly. I believe we were about to vote on the leadership transition. The chairman nodded, visibly shaken by Victor's outburst. Yes, of course. The proposal before shareholders is twofold. First, the permanent removal of Victor Blackwell as CEO and from all positions within Blackwell Industries. Second, the appointment of David Carson as Chief Executive Officer and Chairman of the Executive Committee, Margaret Rose. As the representative of a significant shareholding bloc, I move that we proceed with both measures as a single vote. Seconded, came Monroe's immediate response. The voting process was surprisingly anticlimactic after the drama that had preceded it. Shareholders registered their positions electronically, the results displayed in real time on the conference room's main screen. The numbers climbed steadily in favor of the transition. When the final tally appeared, the outcome was decisive. 78% in favor, 12% against, with 10% abstaining. The motion carries overwhelmingly, the chairman announced. Effective immediately. Victor Blackwell is removed from all positions within Blackwell Industries, and David Carson is appointed as Chief Executive Officer. A smattering of applause broke out, quickly growing as shareholders rose to their feet. Not celebration exactly, the circumstances were too serious for that, but acknowledgement that a crisis had been addressed decisively. Margaret approached, extending her hand. Congratulations, Mr. CEO, I shook it firmly. Thank you, Margaret, for everything. The hard work begins now, she reminded me. Victor left quite a mess to clean up. I'm aware, I assured her. But I've been planning this transition for weeks. The restructuring plan is ready to implement immediately. As the formal meeting concluded and shareholders began to disperse, Jennifer approached with a tablet displaying breaking news. Blackwell Industries announces leadership change amid fraud allegations. The financial markets were already responding, with Blackwell stock stabilizing after weeks of volatility. Analysts were issuing cautiously optimistic assessments, noting my technological background and the potential for innovation-led growth. I scanned the room, taking in the shifting dynamics. Board members who had once aligned with Victor were now approaching with congratulatory handshakes and assurances of their support. Corporate executives who had avoided me just days earlier were suddenly eager to schedule meetings to discuss their department's contributions. The corporate amnesia was already setting in, the convenient forgetting of past allegiances and failures of judgment. I accepted their overtures with professional courtesy, though I made mental notes of those who had proven themselves opportunists rather than principled leaders. As the crowd thinned, I noticed Sophia still sitting in the back row, watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression. Our eyes met across the room, and for a moment I glimpsed something of the woman I had once loved, intelligent, perceptive, complicated. She rose gracefully and walked toward the exit without approaching me. At the door, she paused, looking back one last time before disappearing into the corridor. Jennifer appeared at my side. That was quite a performance by Victor. Not a performance, I corrected. The real Victor Blackwell finally revealed when his carefully constructed facade cracked. "And now his company is yours," she observed. "Poetic justice." I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling onto my shoulders. Not just justice, vindication. 3 months after the shareholder meeting that changed everything, I stood in what had once been Victor Blackwell's office. Now, mine. The space had been completely redesigned, the ostentatious mahogany and leather replaced with clean lines and open space. The massive desk that had served as Victor's throne was gone, replaced by a modular workstation that allowed for collaboration rather than intimidation. The transformation of the office mirrored the broader changes throughout Blackwell Industries, or rather, Nexus Global, as the company was now known. The rebranding had been my first official act as CEO, a clear signal that we were breaking decisively with the past and building something new on the foundation of my original technology. I gazed out at the city skyline, reflecting on how much had changed in just 90 days. The corporate restructuring had been comprehensive but surgical, removing Victor's cronies while retaining valuable talent. My former team members had returned, bringing with them fresh perspectives from their brief time away. The company culture was transforming, slowly but perceptibly, from one of fear and competition to one of innovation and collaboration. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Jennifer entered, carrying a tablet with the quarterly results we would be presenting to analysts the following morning. "Final numbers," she said, handing me the tablet. "We've exceeded projections in every division." I scanned the figures, noting with satisfaction that the AI security division, built on my Nexus technology, had performed particularly well. The market's responding to stability and authentic innovation, and to a CEO who actually understands the technology, Jennifer added with a smile. As my newly appointed Chief Operating Officer, she had been instrumental in executing the transition plan. "The board is pleased," I noted, scrolling through the detailed breakdowns. "Even the most skeptical members have come around. Success is a powerful persuader." Jennifer took a seat across from me. "Speaking of the board," Margaret called, "the nominating committee has approved all your recommended appointments. The board will be fully reconstituted by next quarter." I nodded, setting down the tablet. With these new appointments, the transformation of corporate governance would be complete. Stronger oversight, greater transparency, and a balanced focus on innovation and ethical business practices. "Any word from Victor?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Jennifer's expression hardened slightly. "Still in Monaco, still threatening various legal actions, still being investigated by the SEC. His assets remain frozen pending the outcome of the federal investigation." Victor's fall had been as spectacular as his rise. Within weeks of his removal, the evidence we had gathered had triggered multiple regulatory investigations. His personal fortune had evaporated, his reputation was in tatters, and his former allies had abandoned him. The man who had once commanded an empire was now effectively in exile, wealthy enough to avoid immediate consequences, but permanently stripped of power and influence. "And Sophia?" I kept my voice neutral, though the question still carried emotional. "Wait." Jennifer hesitated, clearly gauging my reaction. "The divorce was finalized yesterday. Her settlement was modest considering the circumstances. I had neither punished nor rewarded Sophia in the divorce proceedings. Despite her role in my professional execution, she had ultimately provided crucial evidence against Victor. Without her access to his private server, we might not have uncovered the full extent of his fraud. The settlement reflected that complicated reality, fair but not generous. She's leaving the country," Jennifer added. "According to her attorney, she's accepted a position with a fashion house in Milan. A fresh start." I absorbed this information with an unexpected twinge of, not regret exactly, but acknowledgement of closure. The chapter of my life that included Sophia was finally, definitively over. "Good for her," I said simply. Jennifer studied me for a moment. "You never told me what was on that flash drive she gave you, beyond the evidence against Victor." I hesitated, considering how much to share. The flash drive had indeed contained damning evidence against Victor, the emails and financial records that had proven decisive in the shareholder meeting. But it had also contained something else, a personal letter from Sophia explaining her actions, her regrets, her hopes that I would find happiness even if it could never again be with her. "Just evidence," I said finally. "Some things were better left private, even from trusted colleagues." Jennifer accepted this with a nod, though her expression suggested she suspected there was more to the story. "The executive team is waiting in the conference room," she reminded me, changing the subject. "Final review of tomorrow's presentation." I rose, straightening my jacket. "Let's not keep them waiting." As we walked through the executive floor, employees nodded respectfully or offered brief greetings. The atmosphere was focused but not tense, productive rather than fearful. The cultural shift was still a work in progress, but the improvement was palpable. The conference room was filled with a mix of familiar faces and new talent. My original team members alongside strategically recruited executives who brought fresh perspectives. They were engaged in animated discussion about upcoming product launches and research initiatives, falling silent as I entered. "Please continue," I said, taking my seat at the head of the table. "I'm interested in what you were discussing." The next hour was devoted to finalizing our presentation to analysts, refining messaging, anticipating questions, ensuring our strategic vision was clearly communicated. The focus was not just on the impressive quarterly results, but on the long-term innovation roadmap that would sustain growth for years to come. As the meeting concluded and executives filtered out, Patricia Winters, Victor's former COO, who had served briefly as interim CEO, lingered behind. "A moment of your time, David," she requested. I nodded, curious. Patricia had been one of the few senior executives I had retained during the transition, recognizing that her operational expertise was valuable and that her loyalty had always been to the company rather than to Victor personally. "I wanted to say this privately," she began once we were alone. "What you've accomplished in these 3 months is remarkable. Not just the financial turnaround, but the renewal of purpose throughout the organization. Thank you, Patricia. That means a lot coming from you. She smiled slightly. I've been here through 3 CEOs now. Victor built something significant, but he lost sight of what mattered. You've restored the balance between innovation and integrity. I acknowledged her assessment with a nod. That's the foundation of sustainable success. Indeed. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. There's something else. The board has asked me to explore a potential acquisition, a cybersecurity firm with complementary technology. Given your experience on both sides of the acquisition process, I wanted your perspective on how to approach it ethically. The irony wasn't lost on me. 3 months ago, I had been the victim of a corporate betrayal orchestrated by my wife and her powerful boss. Now I sat in that same boss's chair, guiding the company toward a more principled future. The key is alignment, I told her. Not just technological and financial, but philosophical. The leadership needs to share our commitment to innovation and ethics. Patricia nodded, taking notes. And the integration, respectful, preservation of the elements that made the acquisition target valuable in the first place. Clear communication of expectations and opportunities. I smiled slightly. And absolutely transparent documentation of intellectual property rights. After Patricia left, I returned to the window, gazing out at the city as evening descended. Lights flickered on in buildings across the skyline, each representing countless stories of ambition, failure, resilience, and redemption, not unlike my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Margaret. Congratulations on the quarterly results. Victor would be apoplectic. I smiled at her characteristic directness. Margaret had become not just a business ally, but a friend, her strategic guidance invaluable during the transition. I typed a response. Success is the best revenge. Her reply came immediately. No, success is its own reward. Revenge was just the catalyst. She was right, of course. What had begun as a mission of justice and retribution had evolved into something more meaningful, the creation of a company that embodied my original vision for Nexus. The technology that Victor had tried to steal was now fulfilling its potential. Under my leadership, protected by the very governance structures he had circumvented, I had lost a wife but gained an empire. I had experienced betrayal but discovered true allies. I had been forced out of a company only to return as its leader. The symmetry was perfect, the resolution complete. As darkness fell over the city, I turned away from the window and back to my desk, where plans for the company's future awaited my attention. Victor Blackwell had taken everything from me, believing I would accept defeat. Instead, I had taken everything from him and transformed it into something better than he could have imagined. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.